I want to introduce this speech with an analysis of the situation in Brazil, and then a chronology of the events in June. Then I comment about the possibilities, the developments that were opened by the movement. I believe that most of you followed the massive wave of protests that swept Brazil. Some may call it Brazilian Spring, vinegar revolt. Yesterday I told about the journalist arrested for using vinegar against tear gas bombs. For Brazilian policy, vinegar is a very dangerous product. It appears like so. And although not a name exists to describe it, the fact is that the popular uprising that emerged in June is the biggest mass movement since 1992, when the conservative President Fernando Collor was impeached. And it happened during a time of popular euphoria, and in a month that was supposedly reserved to the artificial celebration of Confederations Cup FIFA, the great entity of Football International that put the football as a big business and is involved in many corruption scams. And the revolt surprised everyone, from the government to the radical left, from FIFA to the own Brazilian people that still had doubts in its capacity of self-organization and the collective action. I said popular euphoria, that the revolt happened amid that, because even though I do not support the Workers' Party government that's led by the President Dilma Rousseff, it's the Lula's chosen successor, I can't deny that there is a popular perception of poor and working people that their lives had improved in the last 10 years. What are the reasons for this perception? An improvement in income from compensatory programs like Bolsa Familia and a kind of that. A credit boom that activated the internal market, and the influx of millions of people that were in the informality of labor market that now have formal protection, formal jobs. The problem is that although there is this popular perception of a considerable change, there is something that not even comes close to the great gains of bankers and businessmen who continue and grew all these 11 years that Lula and Workers' Party had came to power, the presidents of Brazil. It's possible to establish a kind of a knowledge with the reformism without reforms that we see in Britain and in the Europe with the Labour Party and the other social democracy parties. But as I said I think yesterday, Brazil is characterized by a lack of structural reforms. We have the bad-fare state, not the welfare state. So even small changes like compensatory programs, Bolsa Familia, programs like that have no guarantee of stability, of universal benefit, they make difference for the popular perception of the things. An example of this absence of structural reforms in the last 11 years is the land reform. The landless people, the landless movement in Brazil, we call MST, not even an initiative of the government about the land reform in all these 11 years. Another example involves the issue of the public service, in particular public transport, education, health. The government spends more than 40% of the public budget to the public debt in Brazil. That's a request by IMF since the 20 years that they dictate this policy. And the Workers' Party, before they came to presidency, they advocated the need of the suspension of the payment of the public debt. Now they reversed the opinion. But the popular perception of improvement in income and employment comes with a rage against the poor quality of the public service, the precarity, many things. And this is in the same time that Dilma and the right-wing opposition parties in local governments spend billions of dollars in loans to large companies in the building of stadiums and projects for the World Cup in 2014. and decide to privatize airports and ports with the justification to modernize infrastructure in Brazil. In short, they don't have money for the workers and poor people, but they have for FIFA to the big capitalists. That's the point. And the people realize that. But the spark for the uprising, I think that's very clear if you follow it by the socialist work and another left media in Britain and near Europe, was increasing public transport fares in June in São Paulo and many main cities of Brazil. The public transport in Brazil is municipal. The city manages it, but it's private. That is, the state manages the concession and gives the concession to private companies to manage that. The fare increases happen usually in the beginning of the year. Oh, there is January, let's put some 50 cents more, 40 cents more, 10 cents, low the inflation, high the inflation. Now they put behind the inflation to say, oh, it's not too big. 20 Brazilian cent, 20 Brazilian real, the Brazilian money, cents of increase in São Paulo. That's like 7 pennies. Yeah. They say, oh, it's not a big thing. You are mobilizing for 20 cents. But I think they repent, because the word that 20 cents is more expensive of the history. And they decided to increase the fares in June, because Dilma decided to give a reduced taxes to business businessmen, reduce taxes, many things, and they sonegate. They have many fiscal benefits. That's much generous from Dilma to the businessmen. And months before June, when started this fight, the struggle, the whole movement, there were some victory struggles in Porto Alegre. Porto Alegre is a city in the south of Brazil. It was founded the World Social Forum. That they achieved the revocation of bus fares, of the bus fares increases. And other cities, small towns, also achieved this victory. So the accumulation of these victories and the revocations around Brazilian cities brought confidence to the struggle in São Paulo and Rio. Rio also had an increase in transport fares in June. That I think that was the decisive element for we achieve this victory. The protest started since the mayor of São Paulo. The mayor of São Paulo is from Workers' Party, the same party of Lula and Dilma, and the governor of São Paulo is from the right-wing party, the opposition to Dilma. They decided together to increase the subway and the bus in São Paulo. Since then, the MPL, that's a social movement in Brazil, called, translating, Free Fares Movement. It's a social movement in defense of the free public transport, of the transport as a social right, like education and health, and like a public service. It's rethink the logic of the city in Brazil. That's for some few people, for the rich people, against the poor people who doesn't have right to the city. And the protests were, it's funny, because the protests were in a very radicalized way. I remember the first protest. I didn't go to the first protest. It was in the, June 3rd. And were like some 3,000 of people in the protest. And then some young people, younger than me, I'm young, but let's put a fire in everything, and that goes, no, let's put. And it was a decisive element for the victory of the movement, because it stopped the main ways of São Paulo. You imagine, São Paulo is a city of 10 million of people. When you stop the main road of São Paulo, all the rich people, the class media going back into work, you are ruining my return to home, and you are middle class people, vandals who doesn't respect their right of go and back, and that goes. It gave importance to the movement. 10 minutes, so it's better. If you go 2 minutes, I couldn't resume the speech. And gave importance to the movement. The media was condemning from the beginning. It's funny when a reactionary. Well, I will back later because I will lost the phone. And then were radicalized protests. It started with a few thousand people. Then the next week, there were 10,000 people in the street against the increased fares, against the police. There was a chant that when the police wasn't in the protest, was very pacific. And then we said, no cop, what a coincidence, no cops, no violence. Then they appeared and the violence happened, the repression. And they arrested many activists, dozens of activists. They arrested a journalist for using vinegar, many absurds of the Brazilian police. And then on June 11th, there was a protest in São Paulo again with, 20,000 of people. It was the biggest protest in São Paulo that I ever saw. I'm in the social militants since 2005. I saw protests with 5,000 people, 10,000 people, but protests called by all trade union federations, social movements, and never saw 20,000 people protest called by one social movement it's a small social movement. The MPL, the Free Fire Movement, has like 100 of activists, 150. They majorly are students, the majority. To see the hate of the people against the increased fares. That's what was a popular demand. And the police repression was very, very brutal. They attacked not only us, not only the activists that were in the act, but also journalists, people who weren't in the protest, people walking by the street. Oh, you are an activist. Bah, rubber bullet and tear gas bomb. And there he goes. And I think that was in Rio happened a protest in the same day. Was a minor protest, but against the increased fares, and was repressed by policy also. I think that day, June 11th, was a turning point of the movement. Because the media, everybody who, I don't know if I support, I am against the increased fare, but I don't know if I support the protest. Everybody was for right now. They were against and now were for. The media that condemned the movement, okay, I think we were wrong, the police exaggerated, you are right. But they tried to weaken the radical political content of the movement. And now I tell the story of the reactionary presenter. There is I think Alfredo, I don't know if Alfredo knows, Datena. It's a famous reactionary television presenter in São Paulo, in Brazil. It's very popular, unfortunately. And he was doing a live poll on TV about the protests. Oh, do you support the protests that are happening in São Paulo? And there he goes. My grandfather is a fan of him, unfortunately, too. And then he said to me the story, and I saw it. It's on YouTube. You can see. I think it's in English also, with subtitles. And then the most of people said, yeah, I support the protest. And then let's do again I think the poll is wrong. Let's do it again. Do you support protests with riot, violence? Yes. Oh, I'm wrong. People is right. You have to go to the streets. That's how it goes. The media, the mass media, the capitalist media was obligated to change their position. Until now, there were only protests against this issue of transport fares. But in the following days, there started to happen protests against the public investments in the World Cup in stadiums and in defense of public service, too. In Brasilia, that's the capital of Brazil, the Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte, it's also a main city. And then hundreds of people and then small towns, people went to the streets. Hundreds of thousands of people went to the streets. And even on a game day of the Brazilian national team. In Brazil, that's very important. During a game of a competition official. And in most cities were radicalized acts against the police brutality and many other issues. But the situation became so complicated to these leaders and politicians that said, oh, 20 cents isn't a big thing, isn't a big issue. And they were obligated on the same week that after that were major protests, massive protests with 100,000 of people, 200,000 of people, they reduced the fares in São Paulo, in Rio, in the main cities. Then everybody, oh, now we can. Before they said, oh, it's a technical decision. I can't reduce the fare. If I reduce the transport fare, I have to cut the money from health, from education, from... No, it's a political decision. You can cut from the businessmen of the buses. Why not? And then they did. But I think the most important of all this was the confidence of the people in collective action, that in Brazil was a kind of lost, oh, it isn't... Why you go to streets, it's going to happen nothing, and there it goes. I think that the self-organization, the popular self-organization is back in agenda in Brazil. Not just by the social movements, like landless, the homeless people. And it's also clear that contradictions arose within the movement. The next day that the mayor and the governors announced the revocation of the fares, there was an act of celebration in São Paulo for the victory of the revocation. But social movements and left organizations, minor activists like LGBT people, there is in Brazil a project of gay cure, a very reactionary project that the LGBT people are putting against. That's a politician who supports Dilma government. It's important to say that. And there, in this act in São Paulo of celebration, there were some minor fascist groups that I think exploited the anti-party sentiment about the traditional parties. Oh, party don't represent me. Party don't say nothing about the people's life, the people ordinary life. And the people harassed and attacked the social movements and the organizations in general. This caused some worrying and concern in some leftist activists, because the media and right-wing parties began to say that they supported the protest, but they supported the protest against corruption. But who is in favor of corruption? Everybody is against corruption. But what corruption are you against? I think the corruption is a problem of capitalism, not about the moral, and that's not the point. And the tradition of the Brazilian right about coups and cooptations, that's part of Brazilian history. But I think that was unfounded worrying, because Brazilian right has serious difficulty to put people in the street. Yesterday I talked with a friend of mine. There was a protest called by fascist group, anti-communist groups, calling the return of the military dictatorship in Brazil. There, in São Paulo, in an important point of São Paulo, there were 50 people. That the most people that they can get, 50 people in a protest for a return of military dictatorship. That's the problem. When they propose reactionary positions, I think that they can't put people in the street. We in the left can. The people are in favor of progressive demands. The issue of public services is a progressive demand. Days later, I'm concluding. Days later, Dilma gave an official pronouncement on television saying she would make a national pact for investments in transport, in education, in health, with the royalties in Brazil, but also a referendum about political reform, and a pact for fiscal responsibility. How you can make a national pact for public services and austerity policy? It's impossible. You have to choose one of it. And Dilma, one more, it gives, oh, I want to keep with the social movement, let's put some investments on the public services. And with the Brazilian right that's in the government, oh, the fiscal responsibility is important, we have the economic stability, and many justifications about that. The referendum about political reform is a complicated measure too, because who would make the questions? The government with the opposition? I think that isn't a popular query. A referendum is a popular process. You have to put people in the building of this referendum. I think that's concluding. That's the reason why the movement is entering the new moment. Many chambers, many legislative institutions are now occupied. And more than defense of public services against the fares increase, we also struggle for new forms of democracy, for a directed democracy that respects and promotes the popular self-organization. I think that's a very important element. Another important element is the involvement of the working class and the poor people in this movement. The media tried to summarize all the protests to an issue of youth and students were there. They were important to the movement. But there are happening protests in poor suburbs, and workplaces happen too also. Yesterday was a national day of strikes and demonstrations across Brazil. Was called by all trade union federations. The trade union bureaucracy is pressured to go to streets. And I think that the task of anti-capitalist left that was at the beginning of the protest is continuing in the streets with the people in the workplaces, in the local communities, in the schools, trying to build links with all these people. I think that we can have a new anti-capitalist movement in Brazil, very powerful and with so much potential. Thanks.
The mass movements of starting in June 2013, as Henrique explained, were the largest and most significant protests in Brazil in a generation. If they have shaken up the political system in the country. Because of their explosive growth, the size they reached, and the geographic reach of the demonstrations, they were absolutely remarkable. They also caught everyone by surprise. What I want to do is to examine these movements in light of the achievements and the shortcomings of the democratic transition in the country and the experience of the administrations led by the Workers' Party since 2003. First of all, a summary of the facts. On the 6th of June, the Free Fare Movement, MPL, that's an autonomous, non-party, far-left organization that's been active in the country for several years, led a small demonstration, as Henrique mentioned, 2,000 to 3,000 people, demanding a reversal of public transport price increases in São Paulo. The press criticized the movement heavily for blocking traffic and for making unrealistic demands, and the demonstration was attacked by the police. The MPL kept returning in the following days with larger numbers of people, and the police responded with increasing brutality, beating people indiscriminately, and very importantly, wounding several journalists. This didn't look good on TV. In the next 2 weeks, the demonstrations had exploded in size and spread across the country. They attracted well over 1 million people in hundreds of cities, and mobilizations are still taking place almost every day, including a large movement yesterday organized by the left. They include mainly young workers, students, and the middle class, plus localized movements of categories of workers that can be more or less category specific. As the demonstrations grew and tended to radicalize, the mainstream press and the TV networks suddenly changed sides and eventually attempted to lead the movement, effectively tried to kidnap it, offering blanket coverage, effectively calling people to the street, and very, very importantly, sponsoring the multiplication and de-radicalization of the demands towards a cacophony focusing on broad citizenship issues in order to drown out the left that had started the movement. There were then banners about everything, about public services, about FIFA and the World Cup, about gay rights, drugs, compulsory voting, abortion, religious issues, public spending, privatizations, state monopolies, President Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party, the return of military rule, and especially about corruption. Anyone could come up with their own demand, and if they were individualist and anti-political, this was even better. It was especially paradoxical to see hundreds of thousands of middle-class people expressing indignation about public services that they have no intention of using anytime soon. In common with recent movements elsewhere, the Brazilian demonstrations were largely organized on TV and through social media. They often had no clear leaders and no speeches. What you often found was large and small groups of people marching around in directions that were frequently unclear. Police repression was accompanied sometimes by riots, and then the police would pull back, sometimes attacking the demonstrations, but leaving the rioters alone. Infiltration by the far right and the police was evident. Some early marches were somehow proclaimed to be party-free, and left-wing militants and trade unionists were harassed by thugs, saying, "My party is my country." At the same time, the mobilizations were still growing. Yet as the movement grew, it became both more radicalized and more fragmented. When the federal government finally pushed the cities of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro to reverse the ticket price increases, the mobilizations were already way out of control. Eventually, the left made a coordinated effort to regain leadership of the movement, while the presidency attempted to take the initiative from above with a call for political reform and initiatives to increase spending in public services and improvements in health provision. The demonstrations have subsequently dwindled, except for the nationwide strikes yesterday. What can we learn from this explosion? First lesson is that the movements have confirmed the profound rejection of former President Lula, President Dilma Rousseff, and the PT by large segments of the upper and middle classes and the mainstream media. Their hatred is not because of narrow economic concerns. Lula insisted, probably rightly, that the Brazilian elite never made so much money as they did under his government, and this may well still be true. But fractions of the bourgeoisie and the middle class resent their loss of privilege because of the expansion of citizenship since democratization in the mid-80s, and especially under the PT administration, and because of their realization that the elites can no longer drive Brazilian politics alone. The distribution of income and the expansion of social programs in the last 10 years, marginal as they have been, have benefited tens of millions of people. Consumer credit, perverse as it is, has allowed many poor people to visit shopping centers, fly across the country, and buy a small car. We should criticize some of these aspirations. We should point out that some of them are unsustainable. They are, in some cases, socially undesirable, that they have not been accompanied by the provision of infrastructure, that they are often promoted by the government in order to support large capital. But right now, this is what millions of people want. The result is that Brazilian roads and airports are full, and their previous users complain bitterly about the lack of space to accommodate all those poor people moving about, and now with a sense of entitlement. While large capital did well economically in the last 10 years and even longer, the middle class did not. So-called good jobs in the private and public sectors are scarce, higher education no longer guarantees good income, and the young find it hard to do better economically than their parents did. Middle-class groups desperately want economic growth, but they remain attached to a neoliberal globalist project which slows down growth. They're also frightened by the supposed radicalism of the government, despite the PT's extraordinary moderation, and they're terrified of Brazil becoming another Venezuela. The second lesson is that under favorable economic circumstances, the kind of left neoliberal policies implemented by the PT and the greater legitimacy of the state, which accompanied Lula's election, can disarm the political right and disconnect the radical left from the masses. Lula ended his second administration with 90% approval rates. And Dilma, until recently, had 60 to 70% approval, which had never happened to a president in their third year of office. No party has ever prospered to the left of the PT, and until recently, the right-wing opposition was hopelessly disorganized. For a time, the PT achieved something close to political hegemony in Brazil. Now the PT and the country are locked in political confusion. The third lesson is that the achievements of the PT administrations have raised expectations as well as incomes. The emerging poor want to consume more. Larger masses of people want social inclusion, and both want better public services. The middle classes would like that too, but they're absolutely unwilling to pay higher taxes in order to have them. These are extraordinary demands upon the state, which come in the wake of the decomposition of the traditional working class and the demoralization and disorganization of the left parties and trade unions after the transition to democracy, the transition to neoliberalism, and the elections of Lula and Dilma. The outcome is that while the middle class is confused, angry, and disorganized, the workers are unhappy, mostly for different reasons, marginalized, and also disorganized. This is a recipe for political volatility, and it poses very difficult problems for the left. For example, Dilma Rousseff was elected president by Lula's social base, primarily the poor with the support of large capital. But Dilma had a limitation. She's a technocrat. She had never been elected to anything and did not have her own political base. Worse, the economy was bound to decelerate during her administration, leading to tensions because of existing dissatisfactions, conflicting aspirations, and the shrinking ability of the state to address them, especially considering that the entire left controls less than 1/3 of Congress. This makes it impossible for the PT to govern without alliances with undisciplined right-wing parties and unsavory individuals, which have to be managed under the gaze of an unremittingly hostile press and the scrutiny of a right-wing judicial system. The space to manage these contradictions has shrunk recently. Inflation, the current account deficit and the fiscal deficit are rising, and the currency is falling because of the global decline in commodity prices, poor exports, growth slowdown in China, and capital outflows because of the unwinding of quantitative easing in the US, the UK, and the Eurozone. This has led the Central Bank of Brazil to raise interest rates, state-owned banks to cut lending, and the federal government and state-owned enterprises to cut spending. The economy has stalled, and it has become difficult to reduce inequality further without hurting established privileges. These problems have been magnified by a press campaign suggesting that the government is out of touch, corruption is even more prevalent than usual, and the economy is out of control. Dilma's approval in the opinion polls has fallen sharply. Now we can return to the demonstrations. Although they had complex, overlapping, and contradictory determinants, we can identify some of their key features. The first one is confusion, partly because of the lack of working class leadership. Under neoliberalism, the restructuring of capital has reconfigured the working class, dismantled its traditional mechanisms of representation, including most trade unions, associations, and left-wing parties, and largely destroyed the workers' sense of collectivity. We now have a working class socialized under neoliberalism, atomized, inexperienced in collective action, attached to direct web-based communication, and reluctant to accept traditional mechanisms of representation, including parties and trade unions. There's also a narrowing of ambition and a rejection of collective aspirations to change society. The aspirations tend to be limited by the frame of reference imposed by neoliberalism. This makes it difficult to articulate demands and campaign effectively, both because the targets have become more diffuse under neoliberalism and because the workers are predisposed against collective action. Second, the protests express a confluence of dissatisfactions, including against the expansion of citizenship, which has squeezed the middle class, and on the part of the workers and the poor for the continuing widening of citizenship, for better public services and improved living conditions. And both groups protest together because of their perception of dysfunctionality and corruption in state institutions, which the press has hammered relentlessly. All this could probably be managed if the economy was growing, but it is not, and this makes every grievance more urgent and every constraint tighter. Third, there is political confusion to the right of the government and a political vacuum to the left. The common factor across most of these demands and dissatisfactions is the state. Not just state policy, but the structure of the state. In this sense, whether implicitly or explicitly, the demonstrations are about who controls the state and then who controls state policy. If the movement was united, if it had a working class character, if it was led by left organizations, Brazil could be moving towards a revolutionary crisis. But this is not happening. At the very least, because there is no revolutionary party able to mobilize and lead the working class. There's no perception that the state must no longer be dominated by bourgeois class interests. And there's no shared program for social, economic, and political transformation. The protests then express deep frustrations and even despair because it has become impossible to channel discontent through the traditional forms of social representation, which are either controlled by the elite or have been disempowered by the neoliberal reforms. But dissatisfaction without organization tends to be fruitless, and spontaneous mass movements with a mixed class base and fueled by unfocused anger can be destabilizing without being constructive. The need for organization, delegation of power, and compromise within the movement and with outside institutions suggests that recomposing the working class and overcoming its material fragmentation and the cultural separations imposed by neoliberalism requires collectivity in practice. This means talking more than interacting through web-based media. Twitter and Facebook are good ways to exchange discrete bits of information, but they do not allow the exchange of ideas and the formation of bonds of trust. Left initiatives under these circumstances have been focusing on the convergence of programs through common activities and a national coordination of movements, organizations, and parties to propose specific goals for the movement around political reform, the limitation of working hours, state investment in health, transport, and education, the decommodification of public services, democratization of the media, and reform of the police. The point is to identify common platforms which can bring together the workers and the poor, that can marginalize and fragment the middle class and the right, that can put pressure on the federal government while allowing a distinctly working class movement to work together with some state institutions in order to raise from below its influence over policy formulation and implementation. This is instead of targeting the government and inevitably, for lack of specific weight, joining in a subordinate position the aggressive destabilization campaign led by the political right, the middle classes, and the right-wing media. There is no doubt that left-wing administrations tend to implement more progressive policies and to be more accommodating of mass movements than right-wing ones. If the current government lost coherence and became paralyzed, this would not lead to a socialist revolution because there is no ideological, organizational, social, or material basis for that. But it would facilitate a right-wing victory in the presidential elections next year and contribute to the demoralization and disorganization of the Brazilian left. The response of the federal government to the movements after considerable hesitation was precisely to seek left support and quite hesitantly propose a program of political reforms and expansion of public provision which could bring concrete gains to the workers and the poor. I am sorry to conclude that this is not a revolutionary crisis, and it is unlikely to become one. But this is certainly the most important social mobilization in Brazil in 30 years. The point now is to continue to fight on the streets, workplaces, and schools, to continue to broaden and radicalize the movement, to bring out the working class with its specific demands, to defeat the right and disorganize and attract parts of the middle classes, and to push for progressive constitutional and policy changes. If it can be done, and I think it can be done, it could lead to concrete long-term gains to the workers and the left in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like ask about the Bolsa Familia program, if people have revolted against that as well, as it like it's not sufficient And how much is it now, and has it changed over the years, the due that was paid? That's all.
All right,
Well, thanks for two very interesting talks. I was particularly interested in the analysis given by Alfredo over the makeup of the protests and the other factors that he talked about, and the broader situation concerning the working class, which I think is probably reflected in countries around the world rather than just Brazil. But I wanted to ask one question to both speakers, because there was an a sort of assumption being made, I think, in both of what you were saying, that the people who may very well benefit out of this will be the right wing. However, there is a third force, which I am told, at least in one online report that I read, may be the person that Dilma is forced into runoff at the next election, which is one Marina Silva, who is a former PT government minister and environmentalist who defected to the Brazilian Green Party and who got around 19%, I think, of the vote at the last presidential election. And apparently she may be being tipped to be the next president. Now, it could be that she could very well be a kind of third force, and I wondered perhaps whether you could tell us whether this was indeed the case, whether she has any chance, and what sort of politics she has.
I would like to thank you very much for Alfredo for the speech. It was very enlightening, and I was very much preoccupied by having some kind of deep critical analysis, and I appreciate it very much. Is it possible to hear what I'm saying, or what? Yeah? One thing that really been very concerned is about similarity between ANC and PT in Brazil. And I wanted Alfredo to comment if we run a risk of running into the deterioration of PT like ANC, and the minor strikes, a minor massacre in South Africa, and if it's something in Brazil, we will have some social movement where we can pick some crisis, you know, like, so I would very much like if you could establish a parallel between our social political background in each of different countries that I have mentioned, South Africa and Brazil. Thank you very much.
all right, and then it will be the man in the back in the middle with the t-shirt.
I have kind of a question and a contribution. You spoke about the radicalization of towns and cities. I wanted to know about the radicalization within the favelas, because I've been reading a lot about the underclass theory, the theory that of generations upon generations are born into unemployment and stay into unemployment, and it continues to third generation, fourth generation, and it disables them from becoming working class. In which, when I was doing some research about the favelas, what I found out is that according to how the government how they categorize class, more than 56% of the favelas are considered middle class, in which they are then called favela dwellers, in that they, presumably because they are now considered middle class, they are now choosing to live in such poor conditions, and they are choosing to live in tin houses. Some of the statistics which proves that they are middle class is that 50% of them have washing machines, 90% of them have cell phones, and 86% of them plan to buy furniture or kitchen appliances within the next year, which apparently makes you middle class. When really the underclass theory isn't about your housing conditions or your social conditions, but more about your employment. How long are you unemployed, and about if your children are then unemployed, which is obviously bred through the crisis in capitalism. So my question really is that in a social movement, as to use your term, if you have a mass social movement, something that is gathering the population from all cities, how comfortable would you feel to be in a movement that doesn't include the people who are the poorest in your city, the people who are who have always been subject to such harsh conditions, especially seeing as the favelas were founded by African slaves, and they were named barrios africanos, as in the African neighborhoods, with slaves that had no land, and no job prospects, and they've then found the favelas, which then the poor were then pushed into the suburbs, and the favelas continue to grow and continue to rise. And also to speak about something that happened in this country in 2011 when we had the British riots in Tottenham and in South London. We saw a massive radicalisation of youth on the streets. It wasn't purely just youth going out and stealing and looting as they were projected by the right-wing media and by the government, but it was youth that were angry at police brutality, angry at the state of their homes, and angry about fucking everything, to be fair. Like, they have every fucking right to be as angry as they were, but a failure of the left is that we didn't gravitate them, we didn't pull them to us, we didn't, it was a very difficult situation. If I had longer than 3 minutes, I could talk to you to the death about what I think we could have tried that probably would have failed, but a different perspective nonetheless. And I think that would be a great shame to happen in Brazil as well, with such mass movements, and considering there's a demonstration being planned in September, which will be the biggest in Brazil's history.
Can you please sum up?
That if this does happen, and the youth come onto the streets, and then maybe if the social movement then dies down, if these youth are then lost and they go back into the favelas and they go back into the poor social conditions in which they live and never return until the next social upheaval, and aren't politicized to the point where they are continuously thinking and continuously talking, I just think that would be a great shame.
Here, yeah, and then you at the left.
Yeah, just a very brief question. You spoke yesterday about being the nationwide strikes, and I saw in the news there was several blockades, railway workers and stuff like that went on strike. Just a very brief question. What is the sort of state of rank and file organisation across Brazil in workplaces? I mean, was the call for nationwide strikes, did that actually come from rank and file pressure from below? Or was it more of sort of a bureaucratic call for a mass strike? I'm just more interested in the sort of more detailed rank and file organisation that takes place in Brazil at the moment.
Yeah, thanks to both the speakers for the talk. I kind of felt listening to both of you that this talk might have been better described as Brazil, new possibilities but also new dangers in the political situation. And I think that I guess I want to emphasise, first of all, the new sense of possibility. And I think the fact that the Brazilian events occurred at the same time as what was happening in Turkey and in Egypt magnified the ideological impact. And I think the first thing to underline is that sense that the wave of revolts that we saw, the Arab revolutions, the Greek general strikes in 2010, 2011, Occupy and so on, continues. That process around the world continues. It's even more remarkable, and I wouldn't have predicted it, that we've seen in Turkey and in Brazil it occurring against the backdrops of either ongoing or recent booms. In other words, not simply against the kind of colossal impact of austerity that we've seen in Greece, but it's the contradictions of the neoliberal boom, the huge raised expectations, the pressures on infrastructure. It has echoes in some ways of May 68 in that sense of a period of expansion, creating contradictions in society that explode. I also think in some ways, given the retreats we've seen in the working class movement and so on, the fact that it occurs on the streets first shouldn't surprise us. Minorities can move quickly onto the streets. You don't have to convince all your mates to strike. You don't need the same level of organisation and so on. So sometimes that can emerge more quickly. And equally, sometimes it's more confident layers of society, students and so on, who aren't tied down by expectation, that sometimes initiate protests. But unlike the kind of BBC argument that it was entirely middle class, I think it was clearly a diverse class movement. But on the street, you act more as an individual citizen in some senses, and class tensions and the collective class power can be masked, but it can give people confidence. So we saw the strikes yesterday. It'd be interesting to know your assessment of the scale of those strikes. But I do think uncritical celebration of the revolts is not enough. The fact that you see the right wing intervening in Brazil, just like you saw some of the nationalists, the Kemalist nationalists intervening in Turkey to call for a military coup against the AKP government, shows the political dangers and underlines the need for a political leadership that can offer an alternative to the Workers' Party and to the trade union bureaucracy. And I think the arguments about we don't need politics, we don't need parties, runs the risk of opening the door to those more right-wing forces intervening into the movement. I can't help feeling, even despite those problems and the very sober assessment that we've got particularly from Alfredo, I can't help feeling that it's an enormous step forward and there's a new beginning. It may not be on the edge of a socialist revolution, but you do feel that there's new possibilities to do what Henrique said, which is to begin to draw exactly the conclusions that Alfredo had and build an anti-capitalist left that can begin to fight for a different kind of political leadership in Brazil.
Okay, you at the left, and then you there. I only have 2 more indications to speak, so please, I encourage you to just make shorter contributions as well. If you want to.
Again, like other people, thanks a lot to the 2 speakers, because I actually didn't know very much about any of those details. I live in Barcelona, and so obviously there was echoes for me of the Indignados movements, but I think also some of the things you've explained, there's a lot more contradictions in the situation in Brazil. I mean, the mainstream press in Spain never called people to go out in the Indignados movements. So those contradictions, and then the problems that Alfredo raised. And here, some discrepancies. It reminds me of some debates I've been having with some comments about Egypt. One very good intellectual on the left from Spain actually wrote that it was somehow irresponsible for the movements in Egypt to have raised the struggle on the 30th of June against the Muslim Brotherhood, because the only possible outcome was the military taking power. And it seems Alfredo is saying something, not identical, but on the same lines, that somehow the movement is running a risk of going out into the streets against the PT in the absence of an alternative. But I think here there's a certain circular problem, because if we think the movement should do something different, then we need some way of intervening in that movement to propose that. And if we have that means to intervene and propose that, then obviously we can actually say something other than stay at home, it's not the time. So I think, it comes back to that question of how do we intervene? And here, when you have movements that say we don't want parties, well, we found in Barcelona, in Madrid, that you have to be creative. You intervene, but maybe you can't go in with a big flag saying Marxist revolutionary, blah, blah, blah. But we did intervene. I'm a member of in Youth in Catalonia, and we intervened, and we sold our papers on the edge of the squares and so on, and we did participate, and people knew who we were. So it's possible to intervene. The real question is, I mean, do you have the forces? In Barcelona, at least, we did manage to work together, many sectors of the anti-capitalist left, to participate and try to bring together the spirit of the squares and working class struggle and so on. And so the question I'd want to finish up with is something other people have mentioned. I mean, in Brazil, you had the PT, then you had a split off from the PT to the left, PTSU or something that was going to be much more revolutionary, seems to have disappeared. Then you had PSOL that was going to be something much more interesting, and I don't know where it is. So in a movement like that, it should be a place built for the revolutionary left to be involved with the precautions necessary. So where is it?
When Alfredo in particular was talking through the analysis, especially towards the end, to come back to the idea of hope in the future, I think that the word that was going through my head all the time when you were talking was Bolivia and the parallels with it. And when you talked about, for example, the destruction of the traditional working class under the impact of neoliberalism, there's an exact parallel in Bolivia with the destruction of the mining sector and the dispersal of the miners to different parts, the dispersal of the state sector and so on, the decline of manufacturing industry. There's very similar sort of rejections of vanguardist politics and the left parties and so on in a similar scenario. And then when I think about what happened in Bolivia in the last 10 years, from sort of 2000 onwards, it gave me great kind of hope for the future, because it is an immense project to realign a working class that has been completely reshaped. By the way, I don't think the term underclass is the right one to use. I think it's very useful to think of an informal and formal working class. And if you look at Jeff Weber's work on El Alto and Bolivia, is a very interesting description of how that massive popular movement, an insurrectionary popular movement, was built. How, for example, it managed to marginalize the right, which was a real and present danger in Bolivia, the same as it is in Brazil and so on. So, although I accept much of your analysis, and I think it's, a lot of it was very perceptive, I still feel that what we've seen in the last few months, and the last 2 months in particular in Brazil, is a step forward in the reconstruction of a working class movement in Brazil that's independent of the state, that's got its own class interest at heart, and in the end that addresses the questions for socialism in the 21st century, both in Latin America and in the rest of the world, which are the centrality of the working class, The question of confronting the state, and ultimately, most importantly for socialist activists, the building of a mechanism that intervenes and leads that struggle. That's to say, if it's not a revolutionary party, what should we call it? Because I think there's still a crying need for the construction of that revolutionary party to lead that struggle.
I have no one else has indicated after this speaker, so please, if you do have any questions or any shorter contributions, please put your hand up.
I'm going to start with an anecdote and then make a point. One of my younger relatives has started working in a recording studio, and they do voiceovers for documentaries. And they recently had to reschedule to get an actor back in for a documentary about Brazil because the voiceover had been too happy. And they needed to do it again, sounding a lot more concerned and a lot more serious. Because, Henrique's mentioned it, it's what a surprise it is to see people protesting against the World Cup. But, it's not just about people in Brazil like football, it's also these World Cups, the various sporting events, the Olympics in 2016 as well, are supposed to be like a celebration of Brazil's ruling class's success as establishing itself as a world capitalist power now, and that whole image of hooray, Brazil has burst onto the world stage as a power has been completely undermined and been completely taken by surprise by this explosion of unrest. And when you're describing the contradictions of it, I was reminded of a few parallels as well, and in particular, Brazil has been in this category of the BRICS that was come up with in 2001, I think, of the fast expanding economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And people have mentioned South Africa, people have mentioned Turkey, that's also had this both inspiring and contradictory wave of protests after a long boom. But I also thought of India. India has had slower growth than China, but has been growing significantly for a long time. And in the past 2 years, we've had both the biggest general strike that India's seen, and therefore, in terms of raw numbers, the biggest strike in world history. Raw numbers isn't the only thing, but technically the world's biggest strike. And not long before that, seen a very right-wing anti-corruption movement that had middle-class roots and very authoritarian demands. And I suppose, in South Africa, we've got the role of the miners and the Marikana mine, and that is the working class at the centre of it. It's very exciting. But I suppose the point I was going to make is when this economic crisis started, we'd often get the argument that this is a crisis of the US and Europe, but that global capitalism will pull through because of these dynamic new economies that are going to be immune to the crisis. And actually, if there's a message to take from this year, it's that definitely is not the case. Crisis isn't going to spare the emerging economies.
I think it would be important for us to remember, first of all, where the PT came from. Is when we're talking about working class organisation, about the growth of a movement of activists on the ground, of rank and file activists, we should remember that the PT was formed in 1980 by a combination of political organisations, but fundamentally the thrust for its creation came from the growth, the dramatic growth of the CUT, of a rank and file trade union organisation built out of the great strikes in Sao Paulo and so on. I say that because it is a memory, and because although Brazil has undergone a major economic transformation, I think it would be inaccurate for us to imagine that the result of that during that transformation the working class has somehow disappeared. We're talking about what is it, the 8th or the 7th largest economy in the world, in which there has been a massive reconstitution. Yes, a reorganization, but a reconstitution of industry. There is a large and significant working class in those key areas of the economy which have grown in the context of the Brazilian miracle, so that it becomes not just a dream, but actually a way of addressing the material reality of Brazilian society, that there is a working class, that it is central to the project of economic growth, and that it has a memory. that it has a history and a recent history on which to build. PSOL and the other left groups identified with that history too. And so what I'm saying, I suppose, is that what you have here, as it's so often the case, the explosion of mass movement in the street may appear to be spontaneous and to come from nowhere. But actually they very rarely come from nowhere. They're the result of large-scale, sustained organization over time in working class districts. The MST, for example, which Henrique mentioned, is an organization which has been a point of reference for revolutionaries, for socialists, for 30 years now, and which has which really took a very critical position towards Lula very, very early on, largely because he ignored them, and within 3 months a promised land reform turned into the arrest of leaders of the MST. Similarly, with major trade unions, one of the first confrontations that Lula had very early in his regime, in his government, was a confrontation with the public sector workers, with the white-collar workers in the public sector, whose demands for improvement and changes in their pension rights had created major strikes before his election. Lula made a series of promises that he would recognize those rights, and immediately turned on the white-collar unions as soon as he came into power. In fact, PSOL derived some considerable support from those workers who had expected a great deal from Lula and got very little. What is surprising, I think, and what maybe has left people a little, confused, has been the response of Dilma to the risings in the cities. They are not spontaneous and out of nowhere. They are movements which have a history and a past, which have coincided in time in the face of a new series of neoliberal assaults, plus a certain kind of stabilization or a certain paralysis in the economy. That's true. But Dilma responded very, very quickly, apparently with concessions. I don't think they're concessions. I think they're attempts to divert a movement away from a direction that it's clearly developing in, towards coordination, towards looking for common ground and common purpose with the working class movement. Political reform is the diversion of that demand towards the much safer ground of political reform and new forms of kind of electoral organization. So,
please sum up. Sorry.
Yeah, what I'm saying is it's more volatile, more complex, and more hopeful, and that the working class is very, very much not merely a spectator of the movement.
Yes, right here.
Hello? Yeah, just 2 questions. I wanted to ask, because I never heard you mention, either of you, about the connections between other Latin American struggles, which must seem obvious, because, I mean, the Brazilian left parties must know everything about Latin America and must be very interested in that. So please, can you tell me about the connections, and if there are any, or even if there aren't any? And also, another thing that went through my head while I was listening to you was, I never heard much about Brazil for a long time, but one thing I did hear about, and this is just a few years ago, was the massive police attacks, and basically cleanups, like Dodge City, when they went and cleaned up the favelas in Rio and possibly elsewhere, using very brutal force, and what that was about, and who was it under? That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, I've got about 17 points here, so I will try to be efficient. Not in the order of the questions. I absolutely agree what has happened in Brazil is a huge step forward, both in terms of achievements, also in terms of putting a marker for working class organization. It may also halt the rightward march of the government since 2011. This is a technocratic, social democratic administration that was increasingly shifting towards the right. Now there may be enough weight on the left to halt that. So this is massively important tactically and strategically as well. I never said the working class in Brazil didn't exist. This was one of the last speakers. Of course it does. How does a capitalist society reproduce itself? You have a massive working class there. The problem is the composition of the class. Brazil, in 1980, when the PT was founded, 40% of the GDP of Brazil was manufacturing. Now it is 20%. There's been massive job losses in manufacturing. There has been a whole emptying of production chains in the country through the process that we call globalization, but means internationalization of the circuits of capital accumulation in the country. The working class that has emerged in the last 30 years, it is a working class that is much less organized, much less concentrated in large companies producing specific commodities for mass markets. This is a different type of social base. The social base that formed the PT, which was workers in large transnational companies, bank sector workers, and workers, civil servants, lower ranking civil servants, this working class has been mutilated. What you have now is a country with a very different social base. Connected to this, this is also a young country. I was in Brazil last week at a conference, and we were discussing the movements, of course, and then this guy stands up and he says, well, I am doing my master's degree here at this university, and I don't really remember what happened before Lula, because I was 12 years old when Lula won the election. That was back in 2002. Whoa, this is massive. You're talking about a whole generation of people who are active in these movements now, who have been socialized under the PT administrations. This is something for us to think about. Now, employment and unemployment in favelas. Favelas in Brazil have changed a lot in the last several decades, but particularly in the last few years. Very briefly, unemployment is not a significant issue in the country, and one of the major changes in the last decade has been the formalization of employment. During the 1990s, which was a decade of neoliberalism, the country created, or were created in the country, 11 million new jobs, of which 54% were in the informal sector. In the 2000s, 21 million jobs were created, 95% of them in the formal sector, and the majority of them low-paid jobs. This has been part of the process of squeezing the middle class. Higher-paid jobs have declined by 300,000 in the last 10 years. The middle class is squeezed, the bottom is lifting, and real wages have increased substantially, pulled by the minimum wage. So what you find is a squeezing of the people who are at the bottom rising a little bit. Does this amount to a very large middle class? Of course not. The classification of middle class that they use, as the speaker mentioned, is absolutely silly. They split the country into classes A, B, C, D, E, and they use some silly sociological criteria to allocate people. What they are calling now the large middle class in Brazil, more than 100 million people, so more than half of the population, is actually the working poor. These people are evidently working class in character and working class in income as well, but they have higher aspirations because their real incomes have been rising over a period of perhaps 10 years now. Now, the implication is that the people who have been part of these movements were largely from this stratum of the population. About 2/3 were poor workers or students, and a large number of middle-class people, by which I mean upper middle-class people, who looked good on TV because they're beautiful. And they dress well and so on. So they would be appearing on TV, they would have their handmade placards, which they learned to make on television. Most of the people, at least half the people in the demonstrations, had never been to a demonstration before, but the TV taught them how to express themselves for TV in these demonstrations. Okay, now, this is part of a problem, and this is a problem for the left. It's a general problem. You have a working class today that is different from the working class of the high manufacturing age that in this country ended a few decades ago. In Brazil, it ended much more recently. This is a working class that has been decomposed in its traditional form of existence, traditional forms of work, traditional forms of socialization and reproduction at home. This working class has been decomposed by neoliberalism. The problem for the left is to find ways, which you haven't found yet, find ways to represent these people, to bring them together, and to turn their unspoken or spoken demands into collective movements. We haven't been able to do that. But for the first time, and this is well known, but for the first time in a long time, I'm relatively happier to see that I think we are starting to see the emergence of social movements that will have traction, that will actually lead to changes in one place or another. And this will be a process that will take years. This is not something, the form of these movements is not something we can decide at a conference. This is something that has been to be experimented with until something actually works, and then we can move forward on that basis, and the movements will move forward on that basis. But this is a generational, strategic, massive problem for the left internationally. How do you attract this youth, a youth that has been socialized under neoliberalism, and in the case of Brazil, that has been socialized under the PT administrations. There was never any realistic prospect of a military coup in Brazil. Which military officer would want to run São Paulo's transport system? This is just silly. There is no social basis for that. There's no political legitimacy for it. But it was a stick that was used to shake up the movements and the middle class. The middle class in Brazil, what I'm calling middle class would correspond to upper middle class in the UK. They're very right-wing, okay? They're racist, they're very right-wing, and these people earn good money. They have no reason to complain, but they are very unhappy. And there is a substantial social base for the far right among this group. And they're also influential politically. They have ready access to the media, they have influence over their workplace. They are influential people. The left, in this context of dispute, the left as a whole showed an enormous degree of maturity. After 2 or 3 days, when it looked like the right wing was going to hijack the movement, the left came back together in a relatively organized way, relatively cohesively, and tried to pull things back in order, which is really, really important. This doesn't mean taking people off the street at all. And I finished my initial exposition by saying people have to go back to the street, but they have to go back on the left, not on the right, not on the base of chaos. I'm struggling here. Several small left-wing parties, where are they? They are struggling. They are struggling. And this is not a problem of political line. It's not a problem of founding another party. It's a problem of finding a form of organization that represents the working class that exists today and that has social traction. Marina Silva is a stooge of the right. She's a right-wing person. She left the ministry under Lula from the right. She's drifted further to the right. She prays before every meeting. She's profoundly religious. She seeks divine inspiration for her decisions. She would be a menace to everything that has been achieved in Brazil recently. But she may be the candidate selected by the bourgeoisie. This is just like the Republican Party in the United States. You try one person, it doesn't work. You try somebody else, it doesn't work. Then you pick somebody else. Her turn will come, and she may be one of the good choices they've got. The others are worse. Bolsa Familia is immensely important. It gives legitimacy to the government. It distributes income. It dynamizes poorer regions in the country. This is hugely important. It should be expanded. It's also cheap because it's so little money. It should be expanded and not cut.
Please sum up.
I am still trying. Okay, last thing I'm going to say. Political reform is a diversion. Political reform is not a diversion. Political reform is a necessity in Brazil. The political system is unresponsive and profoundly undemocratic, structurally corrupt. It has always been like this. The political reforms, the constitutional plebiscite on political reforms that has been called or may not be called, is an opportunity for the left. But if the left is disorganized, we will lose the vote. And losing the vote will mean an electoral system that will be even more dysfunctional and a campaign funding system that is even more skewed towards the right. So this is something important that we need to pay attention to. I'll stop.
Thank you. Now, Henrique.
I don't know where begin. I think that more than 17 points. First, I remember the question about the football and politics. I'm a big fan of football. And I think the football and politics go together. And every time we have this discussion in left in Brazil, football, I think, like Britain, is an element of popular culture in Brazil. And the fight against military dictatorship, many radical players played a big role, like Socrates. I don't know, he died 2 years ago. And some ultras in Brazil, like in Egypt, took part in some demonstrations. That's very important. But it's important to, I think, Alfredo and people know, football in Brazil, when there is a game, a protest, it's a great sign. During a protest, during a game of football, to have a protest. About the rank and file movement, someone else asked it too. The demonstrations yesterday were called by the trade union federations, by bureaucracy. But there is a not powerful rank and file movement. I can't do a triumphalist evaluation of this issue. We had the Giral rebellion 2 years ago. Giral is an electric dam in the Amazon region, and it employs like 40,000 of workers in conditions almost of slavery. And they did a very radicalized strike with no support of the trade unions. So I think that in the last year, I think that was I don't think it's a statistic, was the year with biggest number of strikes in Brazil in the last 15 years. So I think there is a space for a rank and file movement. But I agree with Alfredo. I think that Brazil, you still have the industrial working class that plays a crucial role in whole movement. But you have a financiarization of economy. Now you have young workers in call centers, in the banking sector. You have the civil buildings that is a very important sector of Brazilian economy now. I think that's one of the decisive elements to Brazil being the BRICS. Now you have a big Brazilian companies that are passing by a process of transnationalization, and the government, the Workers' Party, sponsors that. Every trip that Lula went when he was a president, he brought with him 10 businessmen. Oh, you can do business in Africa and in South America and in other places that, in some places of Latin America, they call Brazil as imperialist. And I think that they are right in many issues. About the issue about favelas, I think that's another decisive element, because I think that, and I think that I will enter in the issue of the Brazilian left. I think the Brazilian left, since the Workers' Party passed for a process of degeneration, of embracing neoliberalism, I think that the Brazilian left just abandoned the grassroots activity in favelas and local communities. You had a powerful movement from below when PT was founded. Like against the cost of life, against the policy brutality. Now I think that you can bring a revival of these movements. Now there is an issue of the social movements in Brazil against the military policy. The police in Brazil is still military and kills many black and poor people. I think someone said about the attacks of police. The last year, the police in São Paulo killed like 400 people with no reason, with no justifying. And that doesn't appear in media. So I think that the intervention of the left in favelas, with local activists, with young people, it's decisive. I think that the question of racism, of police, and of many other things. But like Rio passed for a process of many territories were occupied by the criminal organizations. And now the state took these territories. And for people, many sections of people that live in favelas sees it as a positive thing. And it's complicated because it's a positive thing that you swept the criminal organizations, but there is only the policy. There isn't education, there isn't school, there isn't a hospital, there isn't the political public services, public policies there. You only have the police, the brutality. That's the issue that we have to relate. And the question of left. I think that Brazil passed for two major experiences of Brazilian left. There was the Brazilian Communist Party, before the Workers' Party, that was a Stalinist approach. Then they went to a reformist agenda, defending national development and things like that. They were putting the illegality during twice. One during the Getúlio Vargas period, three times. During Getúlio Vargas period, after Getúlio Vargas, and during the military dictatorship. Then we have PT, the PT, Workers' Party. Workers' Party was like Mike Gonzalez said, it's a party was born in an anti-capitalist program, in a radical way, and then they lost all this profile. But I think that many activists still relating to Workers' Party in some way. They are not affiliated, but they have confidence. They have illusions in the role of the Workers' Party. We have to relate with them. We don't have to be sectarian because they support the first government of left part. The first but the most stable left government in Brazil, left between commas, of course. Another question. There is about favelas again. There is official propaganda about a new middle class in Brazil. Like Alfredo said, that's a criteria about a statistical criteria. Oh, you will receive 200 Brazilian reais, then you are new middle class. 300 Brazilian reais. That they consider a Brazilian to be a part of middle class. But the minimum wage in Brazil is 670 Brazilian reais. How can you be middle class with that? It's an imagination. It's crazy of the government. Of the role of the right wing, I think that we overestimate, the role of the right wing in this whole process. The media will naturally try to capitalize this. The right wing will try to capitalize in electoral ways. The presidential election is the next year. I think that they can put a powerful candidate against Dilma. But
can you please sum up?
Yeah, I'm trying. I'm not sure. I think that there was a slogan in a debate that we had in São Paulo. I agree with that. There is not a coup. There is not a revolution. It's a radical process with advances and losses. And I think that we have to think in a long-term process. But we can have victories in a short time period. We can have it. I think that increase the fair was important victory. We can have more victories with collective action, with confidence, and we have to put our forces in this process. Marina Silva is Alfredo summed it. It's a stooge of the Brazilian right. She left the Green Party. She founded a new party. She says that she isn't from left, she isn't from right, she's above of all this old polemics. And she's a plan B of the Brazilian right. If they can get the traditional right-wing part, that's the PSDB, the party of Brazilian social democracy. Brazil has these things. So Brazilian social democracy, it's a right-wing party, right-wing, very reactionary party. But I'm not sure. It's very soon to know about how the election, the presidential elections will reflect these movements. Everybody is trying to catch up and try to capitalize this. The political reform, I think, in the terms that the government is proposing, is very complicated because, okay, one item that they discussing. the question of funding of the elections. We have private funding of elections in Brazil, so every businessman can go there and put 1 million in a campaign and it gains the election.
Please sum up.
But how we can do a referendum on political reform with this configuration of Brazilian Congress? I think that we can retrocede, not advance. That's I think the danger. That's why there are dangers in this proposal. But I think the popular revolt as a whole was a very important process. I think that we still learning. I think that the left is learning a lot with this process. Can I think spread to another countries in Latin America. There was a general strike in Chile yesterday. There were protests in Paraguay, in Peru. I think that can be a reference for Latin America and other parts of the globe. Thanks.